go for it. And I think we are already live. So welcome everybody to a new edition of Cannamonitor webinar. This one, I'm very glad having finally Guillermo Moreno Sanz, our Aragonese friend, a big name in cannabis science. And today we are discussing something very, very exciting, which is clinical trials with cannabinoids and evidence. And also it comes at, we have been planning it for some time, but also recently we had some new approvals. So it was very pertinent. How are you doing today, Guillermo?
I'm doing great, Arnau. Thanks. It's a pleasure to finally participate in a webinar organized by Cannamonitor. Thanks again for the invitation, and really looking forward to discussing these recent developments.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad having you because, of course, you have a long history of working in cannabinoid research, 20 years. You are a PhD. You have you got your PhD in neuroscience at the Complutense University in Madrid, but you were also a scholar at the University of California, Irvine, always working in cannabinoid science. You have over 30 papers on cannabinoid science and 3 patents on the endocannabinoid system. So I think it's highly relevant having you here. So unless you have any other comment, Guillermo, I think we have 10 slides to cover, looking at the longitudinal history of cannabinoid research over the last 20 years, and also looking at some very relevant questions for the future. So very packed session. I think we should get started. What do you think, Guillermo?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Absolutely. And just mentioning that all this data is available in our Cannamonitor Decide platform, our clinical trials database, our investigational products database, our pharmaceutical cannabis companies database. So all this data is available to subscribers. So before going into the clinical trial data, I wanted to look at a couple of studies that actually Guillermo has authored. They are real-world studies. So I think it's pertinent to set the scope for the discussion, because usually in drug development, in the development of new pharmaceuticals, we are talking always interventional studies with humans. Usually in phase 3 is what allows the launch of these new pharmaceuticals approved. No, but the history of cannabinoid science has been perhaps hasn't always followed the normal path of pharmaceuticals. So there's been a lot of unlicensed access schemes, such as those now growing in Germany, in Australia, in the UK, etc. And actually, Guillermo, as the scientific director of Chiron Europe, you have been very much involved in this, particularly in the Zerenia clinics in Colombia, in the UK. So here, these 2 real-world evidence studies that you have authored were part of this work with Zerenia. So just very, very quickly, the one on the left, which is called Flower Power, was conducted in the UK. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right. You're right.
It was conducted with patients of the Zerenia clinic in the UK, and you were looking at multiple metrics as it related to chronic pain. Yeah. And we saw that on the 4 metrics that we are showing on the screen: health-related, quality of life, depression, sleep, etc. We saw significant improvement, statistically significant improvement in these metrics that affect chronic pain. And then on the right, this was a study conducted in Colombia, looking at different types of extracts, mostly balanced and a little bit CBD extract, if I'm not wrong. And you saw that over 90% of the patients reported significant improvements also in their quality, in their outcomes. And if we look at the second graph, actually, it's their subjective experience of how much these metrics improved, and we see that most of them reported over 50% improvement in their outcomes. No, so we have great data on the efficacy of cannabinoids, I would say, on the real world side. However, Guillermo, how come this data cannot be used for drug development, and how come the medicinal cannabis access schemes, let's say, have been so much divided between the pharmaceutical and the medical? Hard question, but I think you're good person to answer it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Arnau. So when I was working at the university, I was working in drug development, in formal drug development. So typically what you do is you validate a target. In our case, we had the inhibition of Pha, which is the enzyme responsible for the degradation of anandamide. So we were working on a pharmaceutical strategy aim at activating the endocannabinoid system, which is the same thing that THC does. So THC is a CB1 partial agonist. And over the years, since probably the 70s, different pharmaceutical companies have tried to develop cannabinoids that are different from those in the plant, using several different strategies. The reality will go, I mean, we'll see that later on, but there has not been a great success in developing new molecules, including the one that I was working on, which had a fail on a first in human, on a phase 1 study sponsored by the pharmaceutical Bial in France. So basically, we can say that the drugs that have reached marketing authorization are all based in phytocannabinoids, either THC or CBD or a combination of both. There have been other trials trying to develop other drugs. We might touch base later on. But at the end of the day, the pharmacology that we have is that of THC mainly. I mean, CBD might have, we can touch base later on that. But at the end of the day, the access to these drugs might be through formal pharmaceutical development or drug development. For example, Marinol, which is a synthetic version of THC, or Nabilon, which is a modification. It's not the same molecule as THC, but it's a modification of the scaffold of THC that reached approval in the US, both for cachexia associated to AIDS, and also for nausea and vomiting associated to chemotherapy. Then later on, we had national legislations or subnational legislation allowing for doctors to prescribe cannabis extracts. We go back to 1910, which was probably the golden age of cannabis extracts. Cannabis extracts were number 3 on APIs, or active principal ingredients, used by by pharmacists in the treatment of all kind of ailments, because this was years before the development or the development of NSAIDs, for example. Mm-hmm. So the thing is that here's the paradox. Both patients and doctors have access to a non-authorized class of medication, which are cannabinoids. Mm-hmm. So doctors can prescribe, patients can use it, and researchers can gather data about that practice. Mm-hmm. And we thought a series of researchers thought that the more data we can gather, the more we can inform this practice for doctors, which are not required to, can still use cannabis extracts without a marketing authorization. So mm-hmm. in a way, real world evidence contributes to the global body of evidence, because right now, medical evidence or medicine based on evidence has focused maybe too much in randomized clinical trials, mm-hmm. when there are 4 sources of evidence. At the end of the day, doctors, when they need to make a decision, obviously they are going to consider what comes from the drug agency, and typically what mm-hmm. comes from authorization, the dossier that comes with the authorization of a drug. But at the same time, you have the experience of the prescriber, the preferences of the patient, and some other, mm-hmm. Other sources of evidence that a clinician can take into account before deciding a treatment regime. So what we did mm-hmm. is, because in Colombia has a program very similar to the one that we had implemented now in Spain, so extracts only, no flower. We did that study in Colombia. Basically, we asked people to tell us, from baseline, from before using cannabis to now, how much their pain has improved. We use an 11-point score, which is the same that Botanical did and the same as others did. I actually like to present this real world evidence in the context of a broader framework of world evidence. We know we can compare this to evidence coming from Israel, coming from Australia, and we all see the same. So there is no placebo, obviously. So, I mean, you need to take into account that there might be a placebo effect built in on these responses. But at the end of the day, there is an improvement in pay, a general improvement in quality of life associated to health, improvement in sleep. People feel less depressed and less anxious, which also contributes to an improvement in pain perception and report. And the one to the left, it's indeed experiment and a trial or a data collection that we did from T21, which is a patient registry. So that's another way in which data can be collected in a structured manner. And at the end of the day, we assume that this is not definitely sufficient to present in terms of achieving marketing authorization for a drug or a compound, but at the least we were able to gather data that is structured, that comes from one single product. So this is just one flower. The example in Colombia is 2 extracts, but it also, real world evidence gives you a readout that sometimes clinical trials cannot. So for example, just to give you an example, in Colombia, we have 3 chemotypes. So a high THC, very similar to Exilby, 20 milligrams per ml instead of 25. A balanced formulation and a CBD formulation, full spectrum, so it has a little bit of THC. So for example, doctors were afraid of using a chemotype 1 because they were afraid of side effects. So what you see is that actually doctors for pain patients, when all the evidence that we have points toward THC, were using a balance or a chemotype 3, just trying to be cautious. So there's a lot of confounding factors in real world evidence, but it also gives you trends and represents what it's actually happening in reality, which might also give you a lot of information to inform practice and future prescription.
Absolutely. So it's great supporting evidence, right?
It's great support whenever you have a scheme that allows you access to that drug in the market. I think it's a great source of information for prescribers that want to educate themselves and be safe while prescribing cannabis.
Okay, fascinating information, Guillermo. So the thing is, the body of evidence supporting cannabinoid science has been increasing dramatically, I would say, over the last decade in particular, but also over the last few decades. However, in terms of what products were available for patients with indications that we have real-world evidence that can be treated with cannabinoids, it was a very, very limited landscape. And this is in particular because apart from the dronabinol, which here we have as marinol that was approved in the 70s for the 2 very limited indications that you are mentioning, there was only the 2 products by GW Pharma developed. The first one approved in 2010 in the UK, and the second approved in 2018, if I'm not wrong. So one for multiple sclerosis, Sativex, a balanced formulation, and then Epidiolex, high CBD for some rare forms of epilepsy, which in the case of Epidiolex, for instance, the approval was as an orphan drug, given that the Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut were so limited. It was under 80,000 people, if I'm not wrong, in the whole of Europe that have this condition. So this grants its status as an orphan drug. However, in the last week, actually, Germany approved this new drug, Exilby by Botanical. And this, you could say, this is the question actually for you, Guillermo, but apparently the numbers on the headline numbers could point towards a game changer. Why am I saying that? Because there's 10 million people in Germany that you could say that have low back pain, which is the main indication of Exilby, a high THC, but not only high THC like marinol or Canemes or these substances that were already approved, but also a full spectrum for botanical formulation of THC. So Guillermo, that's my question to you. Is Exilby a game changer for cannabinoid science and cannabinoid pharma?
I don't think it's a game changer for cannabinoid science, but it might be a game changer for cannabinoid pharma for different reasons. It's funny because, I mean, if you think about the presentations that we have typically in medicinal cannabis programs, those are mimicking cannabis or cannabis-based authorized medication. So let's say that you have THC in different forms. You have a balanced presentation with Sativex, and then you have a chemotype 3 with Epidiolex. And these are the three types of products that you typically find in different jurisdictions. So I guess that it's because doctors are more familiarized, or feel more safe when they can have a replica of an authorized medication, even if in a magistral format. And a lot of people have tried to use whatever we know about dronabinol, or we know marinol and Sativex, and extrapolate that to magistral preparations. The Exilby case goes the other way around. Exilby is actually a full spectrum extract. It mimics the presentation that Germany has been using for over 25 years. It has 25 milligrams per ml of THC. And then it's a full spectrum, so it has something else. It's funny because, a lot of people really don't care about what else is in there. There might be some CBD. Actually, there's more CBC than CBD. It has a surprisingly low level of CBD. It has some terpenes. When people, it's crazy about what kind of terpenes will you use. For years, we have had this debate about how each variety or strain of cannabis might work for each indication. No, this indicate this. So I think this proves that you only need to go for it, expend the money and the time, and do it. And somebody has finally achieved it. And one of the main criticisms was, okay, well, why would you put this in the market when there is 1,000 replicas available that you can have without the marketing authorization? And at this point, it's just going to be a matter of pricing. If Botanical can get the pricing scheme approved and reimbursed by Pharma and the Germany's authorities, then that will be a game changer for sure, because no doctor is going to prescribe an unlicensed medication for the same indication when you can prescribe the exact same product or a very similar one that has this. I doubt that. So all those doctors that don't want to prescribe a chemotype 1 because it might be too much for my patient, I'd rather go with a balanced oil to begin with, start low, go slow, that might go off the window. Because if you have a proper titration table, because, for example, the titration proposed for Sativex was extremely steep. In theory, a patient with Sativex could be on 30 milligrams of THC after a week or two, which is too much. And this might be one of the reasons why Sativex wasn't as tolerated, and not that it has ethanol and it burns the mouth, which is also true. It's not a very, nice drug to intake. So we'll see if Exilby still has all these steps to go through. But I think that both the indication, because, one thing is spasticity for multiple sclerosis. One thing is, CBD for refractory pediatric epilepsy in 3 minor conditions. And the other thing is, as you're saying, 8% of population have chronic pain, most of them low back pain. So Exilby could be incorporated, and depending, it has the package of studies. We'll touch base later on, but the head-to-head comparison with opioids might do that, or might make that cannabinoids go in the scale of pain. So you have NSAIDs, you have acetaminophen, and then NSAIDs, and then neuroleptics, and then you go to opioids. So maybe Exilby might end up in the guidelines under opioids, and at that point, that is really a game changer.
Absolutely. Great rundown, Guillermo. So as you said, later we're going to discuss a little bit more about what it implies for the future of drug development in the cannabinoid space. But for now, let's take a step back and let's look at how have we arrived at this point, no? And what I would say is, as you said before, of course, the golden age of cannabinoid medicine was at the beginning of the 20th century. But then I would say now we're in the second age, the second golden age, or potentially it's in front of us still, and we can see it clearly in the number of human studies that have been growing year after year over the last 2 decades. I would say in particular after 2015, 2016 is when it really starts ramping up. And we see that there's a peak in 2021, and then it starts, it still maintains. So in this graph, we are seeing the start date of human studies. So it means that many of these studies are still ongoing. However, something that I think is relevant as well is looking at which type of studies are being developed, and later we're seeing a little bit in more detail, but in particular, which phases are the studies that are being initiated year after year. And we see that most of the evidence or being generated for now has been focused on phase 1 and phase 2, even though we can see that some phase 3 and phase 4 more late stage trials start appearing also in the period that we mentioned, 2015, 2016, which might have to do with the already approved products like Sativex and Epidiolex, seeking to expand them to other indications. No, so for instance, we have the phase 4, which is usually the clinical trials that are used for these purposes. Correct me if I'm wrong, Guillermo, but that are already usually for an approved product, and you want to try it with another indication, etc. We start seeing them, for instance, 2020 and 2021. Quite a bit of this. So Guillermo, what's your balance, let's say, of the body of evidence that has been generated over the last decades, and what's next then for cannabinoid clinical trials?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting to see that there is a peak in 2021. That was the year that Jazz Pharmaceuticals acquired GW, right? So, and then from 2018, when Epidiolex was first commercialized, I mean, obviously, I mean, this is, I mean, I keep, you know, for years, I was always, fantasizing about this story. You know, I was living in the US in at the time when, you know, Epidiolex was being developed. And the issue was that a lot of families in Colorado were blowing up their garages trying to make CBD extracts for their daughters and their kids. So at one point, I mean, one can fantasize that the FDA and the NIDA were sitting there and saying, well, we had enough of these people blowing up garages. Let's see if there is a pharmaceutical company that has a CBD product that will do a CBD products. They found GW and they say, listen, if you give us, I mean, you have this spray with THC and CBD, we will give you fast track for a drug orphan if you give us a CBD that, you know, that is not synthetic but is purified, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then it comes Greenwich Biotech, which was the company that GW opened in the US to launch Epidiolex, and from then in comes Jazz in 2021, and then when Jazz acquires GW and basically Epidiolex, they start testing Epidiolex for a lot of different indications. Mm-hmm. Because once you have that market approval for an orphan designation, Jazz Pharmaceuticals being focused on neurological disorders could actually have a breakthrough, you know, if CBD would actually work for something else. It seems that CBD does not work great for nothing else. Again, you know, I'm a pharmacologist, and as a pharmacologist, you know, if you compare THC, the only known agonist that we have for CB1 to CBD, which is a promiscuous molecule that does not dissolve in water, that has a poor solubility and an absorption profile, and that you need higher doses for a hint of efficacy. You know, there's no a lot of reasons to try to develop CBD, if not because it appears in the same plant that THC comes from. So, just to say that I think the promise that Epidiolex brought was not really crystallized in the form of approval for other indications that might be actually more profitable for Jazz Pharmaceuticals, or that might have helped a larger number of patients if CBD would have proven efficacious for in any of those trials. So and then there has been very limited efforts to develop new indications for Sativex. There was a phase 3 study on pain that came out negative, and I think that was kind of the nail on the coffin of Sativex. And honestly, the developing, there has been 20 to 25 years since we don't have a new analgesic. Now we have some sodium channel modulators that might actually hold great promise for as painkillers, but cannabinoids really hold some promise that has not really translated into clinical development until now. And then when I was saying about cannabinoid science, the thing is that we mostly have an idea of what cannabis is good for in terms of indications. And I think that, for example, the report from the National Academy of Sciences in the US that included pain in 2017, that was a big support for the legislations that passed in Europe. The fact that, the National Academy of Sciences was saying that there was robust evidence that cannabinoids could be beneficial for pain, which is something that, the real world evidence was telling everybody. So at that point, if Sativex was not going to be developed into a painkiller, the trials that come with CBD did not show, a significant analgesic potential. So it would be, natural, I think, that somebody will go with a full spectrum THC down that route. There was not so much else to do. So I think that we haven't seen any other large indication or any even niche indication being successfully, tackled with cannabinoids. I think that for years we have been looking for or into this cannabinoid deficiency. Traditionally, when you want to develop a drug and you have a target because there is something that is missing or there is something that is wrong with an organism that develops into a disease, if you can stop that pathway or replenish that pathway with an exogenous drug, that's typically the way in which pharmacotherapy works. I think there is still, some caveats in which cannabinoid might find, might succeed. And one of the common bias that we have on the evidence that we have on cannabinoids is that traditionally cannabis and cannabinoids can only be applied as last resource when patients are beyond any improvement in general, and still we see patients improving. So I think one of the, and we can talk more about, future lines and whatnot, what happens when we give cannabis to people before they go into a refractory phase.
Okay, super interesting, Guillermo. Actually, I wanted to cover a little bit more the, let's say, on what you touched before, that whenever you are trying to develop new regulations, even on the medical and license side in new countries, you always get from the regulators. We experienced that in Spain recently. This all the time. There's not enough evidence. We need more evidence, etc. And here, these 5 graphs show a little bit of what the actual body of evidence represents, and so this includes all the clinical trials across all phases, both all that have been conducted, both the failures and the successes, let's say. And what I would say, something that is immediately apparent, because of course, as you were saying, Guillermo, pain is the main indication that everybody recognizes that most people can benefit. And if we look at the unlicensed medical markets, it's always pain the main indication, even though there's some mental health that and sleep and this sort of thing that it also tends to grow. But whatever, let's talk about future drug development later. But what I think is interesting in terms of the conditions that have been studied is, for instance, the substance abuse and mechanistic work is so prevalent. And this means mechanistic in this context means healthy volunteers, so looking at how it affects the body. And substance abuse, it's often to treat cannabis use disorder and this type of thing. So it's actually not to actually harness the potential of cannabinoids to treat concrete indications, but actually to even to try to prove that it can have some ill effect, etc., etc. Something else that some other insights that I believe are relevant here is, well, we already mentioned that it has been most of the, let's say, the late stage is only about 15% of all the clinical trials that have been developed. So there's still a lot of work that can go there, particularly in terms of drug development. But the placebo-controlled RCTs are actually 49% of all the active clinical trials, which I believe is fairly significant, given that very often you hear from clinicians, from regulators, that we need higher quality of evidence, and they usually refer to placebo-controlled RCT. And then again, also the fact that originally there was a lot of focus on synthetics. If I'm not wrong, in the first or the second decade of the century, synthetic used to be 15 to 20% of the clinical trials, a little bit more. And we are seeing, as time goes on, that botanical, and in particular full spectrum, so this means also including some THC, even in the case of CBD dominant products, are becoming more and more prevalent. So in your opinion, Guillermo, what does this mean about the quality of our body of evidence? And is it true that we are lacking a lot of the studies that could prove the efficacy of cannabis to treat these conditions that we in the industry agree, but we are having sometimes a hard time convincing the regulators that this can actually work?
I mean, the thing is, so in general, randomized clinical trials are, a late phase on let's say research. So I mean, an RCT typically tries to prove efficacy and safety for a drug to be commercialized. So typically all investigational research, so to speak, is done previously, either in preclinical conditions in animals, or let's say that at this point you are more concerned about meeting your endpoints and succeeding at showing what you are trying to show in the trial, than to go for an expedition and look for new indications and whatnot. An exception might be what I mentioned about CBD and just pharmaceuticals, just because owning the product, having exclusivity on a product and being a pharmaceutical company with the ability to run different trials in parallel, that obviously, it's something that it's, only accessible to a large pharmaceutical company. So what you're saying was right. I mean, obviously, in groups in phases 2 and 3, you're going to need a placebo. Phase typically either a dose escalation or a safety study. So, placebo is not sometimes, most of the times, is not even required. But whenever you need to prove efficacy, you obviously need a placebo. One of the criticisms traditionally has been the difficulty of having a true placebo in a cannabis study, either because patients are familiarized with the substance, either because of the odor, either because it's difficult to mask the flavor or the neurologic or the high of THC. So typically patients know if they're receiving the drug or they're receiving a placebo. Still, yeah, we have randomized clinical trials, but with 50% of them with placebo control. But that doesn't mean that the evidence coming from those trials is better because there is a placebo. The placebo is a requirement for it. And and actually, the fact that you cannot distinguish from a placebo might be one of the reasons why those trials did not succeed, or the evidence coming from them is not really supportive of the use of cannabinoids. So on top of that, it's true that pain and neurological indications have been the most studied. Obviously, the mechanistic, there was a lot of work done by NIDA in the 70s and the 80s, by which we understand the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of cannabinoids, both in the inhale route or the oral route, which differ a lot. So we know a lot about the pharmacology of these active ingredients or these principles because of those studies, which were not aimed at showing efficacy, but were aimed at investigating how the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of these molecules work. So I think that if you really studied that body of evidence, we know, there is no so many things that we don't know, honestly, about how cannabis behaves or cannabinoids behave. There are things like, obviously, if you have a new molecule, for example, the one that we were working on, if you don't have natural cannabinoids, if it is the first time in humans that you're going to try something like a new molecule or a new development, you need to start from the very low, from the very ground. You need to your safety, your preclinical safety before you're authorized to put anything new or in humans for the first time. But again, building upon the studies that we have on phytocannabinoids, that's why it might be easier or faster to develop drugs based on THC and CBD, because there's already clinical evidence coming from those registered or authorized medications that can be leveraged for the development of new drugs.
Wow, that's brilliant, Guillermo. Thank you so much. So actually, if we look specifically at the late stage phase 3 and phase 4 clinical trials by indication, we might get a little bit of more insights in where's the focus switching over time. And of course, we see same as in the graph before that. Of course, there's a big increase after 2018, and particularly a big peak in 2020, 2021, etc., etc. But even beyond that, we can see that, of course, if in the previous graph, looking as well at phase 1, phase 2, etc., there was a lot of these mechanistic and substance use disorder studies. In the late stage evidence, let's say, is more clearly focused on pain and neurology, which are, of course, the main indications of the approved products, but also potentially of investigational products that are now being under development. However, if we look at it in relative terms, we see that pain, let's say, has been increasing a little bit more than the average, and neurology a little bit less over time, even though it's still highly represented. However, something that's interesting, I would say, is the increase in, for instance, mental health, which was pretty much absent in the first decade and the second decade of this century. And however, in the last few years, it's already 14% of the clinical trials have to do with mental health. And actually, another category that we left out of this chart, like sleep, is also appearing more and more in the trial. So what you said, Guillermo, that we know already, something, for instance, as well, having to do with inflammation, or now, for instance, with the weight loss and diabetes and this sort of thing. There's also been a lot of recent interest in these more rare and small indications. They are not super prevalent in the data. Of course, pain, neurology are the main indications of cannabinoids. But if we go a little bit beyond that, Guillermo, what do you think can be more explored in the future? Do you think there are some areas that merit more research, and that we could develop perhaps some products for these more niche indications, or for some mental health conditions, anxiety, PTSD, etc., like now it's becoming very prevalent with in the psychedelic space beyond cannabis? Or you think we're going to see more of the same in the next few years?
So, well, I think that the curve you see around 2021, so most of this is, I think, the effort to find some other indication for CBD, for Epidiolex, because so this is phase 3 and 4. So Epidiolex is already approved. So phase 1, you don't need to replicate. Phase 2, you can jump to. It can make conceptual sense to risk and do a phase 3. I will say that these are different pain conditions, neurology, mostly, some neurodegenerative diseases, rare diseases such as Fragile X, some forms of autism. I honestly think that just pharmaceuticals have tried to find what CBD might work within their portfolio. And then we see an increase in substance use disorders. And this might be, other kind of pharmaceuticals that aim at reducing or preventing or helping cannabis use disorder, which has also been more prevalent since people have more access to it.
Yeah.
I think what is interesting is the mental health. There are not many, but CBD has been investigated for anxiety, because also, this general understanding that mid to high doses of CBD might, induce anxiety-like properties in humans, depending on, reports on self-medication from different jurisdictions. Again, without, a lot of success. I mean, it seems like very high doses of CBD are required. So that comes with safety and economic constraints. So I think that I would like to see if with Exilby out now, we have, there's a renaissance for CV1 pharmacology and THC, meaning that THC is probably the most powerful molecule that we have in cannabis. The pharmacology of cannabinoid receptors is the one that we have best described. And there's a couple of, mental health is definitely a frontier there. Cannabis and cannabinoids might have their own psychiatric side effects. We know that, schizophrenia and psychosis might precipitate it in a vulnerable population by activation of CV1 or chronic use of cannabis in vulnerable individuals. So there is there's a general concern about experimenting with cannabinoids for mental health, but we have described some indications that are very prevalent in mental health, such as PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, or emotionally unstable personality disorders, formerly borderline disorder, personality disorder, that might benefit, also ADHD, that might benefit from a therapy with cannabinoids. So maybe, that now that there's a THC full spectrum authorized medication, Botanical or some other pharmaceutical company acquiring the rights to Exilby might initiate phase 3 without needing to go back to a phase 1 on, other indications that, THC might still hold potential. Obstructive sleep apnea, for example, is one of them. There might be an example, later on other people trying to focus on those indications through activation of CV1. So I think that those might be niche indications in which still, now that we have an approved molecule and an approved medication, there might be some research in coming years. And of course, there's always the idea of using advanced pharmaceutical formulations, so slow release, more water soluble formulation. So this has also always been in the interest of the industry, also because allowed a different strategy for IP creation.
Yeah.
But from an efficacy standpoint, there has not been a lot of promise with them.
Yeah, actually, this is our next topic, and I need to ask Guillermo, because now we got a lot of questions, so we want to have a little bit of space at the end, so we need to speed up just slightly. Just a mention on the regulatory pathways, of course, that are available to register products, and the fact that there's been a certain patent wall, which is always part of the pharmaceutical industry, built in particular by GW, concerning their indications and their products, no? And there's been several strategies to go around this by the biotech companies that have some products in investigation. So some examples would be using the same molecule for a new indication that hasn't been patented, which you said, Guillermo, there's some companies that are attempting it. Let's say you can have as well a new molecule, or as you were just mentioning, of course, new delivery systems that even though it's the same compound, target something different. And then the one that Botanical, the route that Botanical went through, which is the full spectrum Botanical. I don't know if you have any comment on this, Guillermo, what do you think are if you think that it's, because I remember a lot of talk when I started in the industry 2019, 2020, that many people were saying, no, GW has everything patented. There's no products that can be developed. However, Botanical has shown that this is not the case, and there's some other companies that are pushing through it. So I want to get your take on this very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, I mean, I'm not an expert on IP on pharma IP, but definitely, these were different strategy. For example, we had a patent on the Phi inhibitors that we were developing. I mean, from the University of California. Those were licensed to small biotechs, and then the small biotech. Yeah, I mean, the aim of this is to de-risk the technology to a point in which you can have an exit from a small or large pharma. So it's basically what GW did with Jazz. So I think that all of these were potential strategies to circumvent the IP wall. The full spectrum botanical as a drug also had the criticism that you will have competition from the unlicensed market. And that it will be difficult to reach, marketing authorization. And in the case you reach marketing authorization, people will be able to still use other products available in the market. But either the magistral market did not develop as fast as expected, that you had the time to actually gather marketing authorization, and now that the magistral market is focusing on the flower, let's be honest about that, and not so much in the oral route, you have this product might actually put to sleep most of the oral magistral formulations, because at the end of the day, unless a doctor really wants to go with a balance oil or with a chemotype 3 oil, it will have to probably prescribe Exilby if they want to go with a full spectrum THC.
This can be massive, and actually, Botanical, they also did it relatively fast, I would say. No, usually in pharma, you say that it takes a decade and a billion to develop a new product. They did it, I think, 6 or 7 years. I believe their first trial was registered in 2021, 5 years ago. Probably there was some work before that, but I think the founder mentioned 7 years, and they had these 2 phase 3 trials that were successful. And I would say in particular, this one head-to-head against opioids is quite an interesting one. Germany, which is where it has gotten approval first, has 18 million prescriptions for opioids every year. So it's not only targeting a massive, the pain, the low back pain, which is a massive indication, but also it has proved that it can beat opioids. And now they are working on some other trials, particularly in the United States, which could open, of course, a massive market. Just to mention, Epidiolex, it was developed in the UK. It got approval. It got approval as well in Canada, I believe, initially. In the case of
Sativex.
Oh yeah, you're right. This was Sativex. Sorry, but in any case, Epidiolex, their main market is the US. Just
yeah.
So of course,
Epidiolex was developed first in the US, and then it came to Europe. So I mean, with the honestly, now if Exilby might enter the analgesic ladder before opioids, all doctors will have to prescribe Exilby before an opioid, which I think will be, I mean, it will be great for Botanical, of course, but it will also be great for patients. The fact that we can have a mild analgesic to be used before opioids, just because there is no alternative for these patients that end up on opioids. The sooner we start using cannabinoids in the let's say in the path of patients to to chronification of their condition, the better. Because at the end of the day, what we see is that cannabinoids might be very helpful on the transition from acute pain to chronic pain. Obviously, all of these patients are going to have already chronic pain and chronic low back pain, and they might find not adequate support from NSAIDs and acetaminophen and some other molecules. But if they can test, or if they can be prescribed cannabinoid rather than an opioid, I think that hopefully we will see a very positive large effect of the introduction of this therapy in the regular health services.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Okay, we have a lot of questions, but I just wanna talk very, very briefly about the potential for future drug development. Here we are seeing the phase 3 and 4 trials by both CBD and THC, and we see that there's about double the late stage trials for CBD than there are for THC. So even though botanical success has been with full spectrum THC, we see that most of the new investigational products are actually focused on CBD, which is interesting, and we see that pain and neurology concentrate the indications, same as in the past, I would say, and we see that there's still some products that are going through the pipeline for approval. Most of them, as we see, are for either CBD or also some new formulations of dronabinol, but we also have a long list of products that haven't been successful. Some of them due to corporate reasons, but also due to failure in phase 3. Like a big case you commented before was the Sativex for neuropathic pain in the US, but there have been a few more. So Guillermo, before answering some questions that are very interesting, so I want to dedicate some time to them.
Yeah.
What do you think is next for specifically cannabinoid drug development? Do you think the stack is full already with these 4 approved products that we have now in pharmaceutical, or do you think some of these candidates that we have here for more niche indications perhaps can also become approved over the next few years?
I mean, I think that the same as the same curve we saw for CBD, I hope that we see for Exilby or formulations like that. So let's see what else THC is good for. Maybe try some other indications. Once we see a solid return of from the market or a solid feedback on Exilby, there might be some refinement. So fast acting, better absorption. Those are technologies that have been developed, and depending on how fast you can bring that to approval, depending on how tested is your platform for delivery, then you will have to go through several more or less hoops until you reach market authorization with that. And if it represents a concrete advantage for either the patient or the prescriber, so I mean, you can take it once a day or once every week or a sustained release, things like that we might see once the target is validated. So meaning that there's a strong market traction of that compound. I don't know if we will see chemotype 3, chemotype 2 extracts mimicking the same path, because honestly, I mean, from my standpoint, THC is the effective molecule. We'll see if there's I don't think there will be a significant impact of side effects by not having the entourage of CBD. We'll see. And I think that in the immediate years, those will be, probably or most likely what we see. I mean, obviously the inhaled route, it's very beneficial, it's very fast. We already have people working with extracts and medical devices for pulmonary administration of cannabinoids, and that might also be one route that it might be
absolutely working. This is something we haven't covered, but is indeed very interesting, and there's also a very dynamic sector, I would say, not only big acquisitions like the one of Psyche recently, but also 2 new medical devices approved in Europe in the last year and some more in the pipeline. So maybe we need to talk about that in the future. So before jumping into some questions, thank you so much, Guillermo, for this magistral presentation.
This was
great. And actually, I'm loving the questions. We have some deep ones. Let me start by by one that maybe I can answer. It says, what would be interesting apart from the number of studies is the total patients enrolled. So I looked into this. I have it in my database as well. And it was the total aggregate was something quite crazy. I think it was something like 200,000 people have gone through these clinical trials in the database. which is mental. I looked into it. I thought it was confounding in some cases, because then a massive trial, would overpower the graph. So I decided on just showing it on number of clinical trials, but we indeed looked at the number of patients that were enrolled as well. And then we have a question by Borja Romero, Guillermo, that asks, it's very complicated, so I'm not sure I understand, but why are not any clinical trials with AEA and 2AG, virodamine, etc.? I might find oral and topic PEA without medical prescription in Amazon. Is there any company planning clinical trials on this issue? Do you understand the question?
Yes. Yes, this is interesting. I'm not familiar. I mean, I don't think oral anandamide and 2AG. So anandamide and 2AG are the endogenous cannabinoids. So will be like, instead of taking an inhibitor of the reuptake of serotonin, which are the anxiolytics that we typically use, it will be like taking serotonin itself. So I don't think anandamide and 2AG, they're also lipids. They might be more expensive to produce. So I don't think they're good from a drug development standpoint. What we have tried, the technology that I was working on, are inhibitors of anandamide degradation. There are also inhibitors of 2AG degradation that have gone through clinical development. All of the difference with these molecules is that rather than activating all the receptors that they find, they only concentrate where the body is actually producing them. So Phi inhibitors, particularly for pain, after were investigated in 2012, there is so Pfizer and Janssen, the largest two. Now with the GLP one, this might have changed, but Janssen and Pfizer, they both have in their pipeline inhibitors of anandamide degradation, so molecules that raise the levels of anandamide. PEA has been authorized in Italy, for example, as a dietary supplement because it's a natural product. I think it's extracted from egg, but it's palmitoyl ethanolamide, so it's a molecule that is similar to anandamide but does not bind to CB1 receptors. So there is some clinical evidence about what these products could be good for, but they don't seem like suitable candidates for clinical development.
Very interesting, Guillermo. Thank you for that. Then Gil Luxembourg is asking how many of the clinical trials are cannabis-based versus how many are distillates. I think he means more like isolate, because in my view, distillate usually it's more. It can be considered a full spectrum product as well. And I would say over time it has been trending towards more full spectrum products. We still have, as we saw in the candidates, quite a few of the isolates that build on the, let's say, on the dronabinol approved marketing authorization and so on. No? What do you think, Guillermo?
So I think that there hasn't been a lot of molecules that are not THC or CBD. There are some, but there is not a lot of them. Now, if it is important that THC and CBD are distillated, isolated, purified, or they're embedded within the original matrix because of the entourage, blah, 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 why not? I mean, from a pharmaceutical standpoint, whatever is not an API is either an excipient or a contaminant or a contaminant. So I think Exilby also proves that it's not that who cares about what else is in there, because now that you have gone through the botanical drug route, you will need to keep your stability also in those molecules. But those are not the active molecules in the drug. So I think that at the end of the day, you need to be a little bit pragmatic, because otherwise there are so many variables that you need to distinguish between those that are relevant or those that are irrelevant.
Interesting. So then a little bit related to this, Gunther van der Walt, which I believe is a PhD candidate in near Barcelona, he mentions, what about cannabinoid combinations? There's some good evidence on CBD, CBG synergy in liver disease coming out of Israel, for instance, or other combinations of cannabinoids. How much potential in the space is there for the minor cannabinoids, Guillermo?
So, I mean, the minor cannabinoids, from a preclinical standpoint, there's nothing that screams at us that I know of. I know CBG, for example, or CBGA has been shown to be or to modulate the activity of the NaV1.4, or I mean one of these sodium channels that now it's been aimed for the development of other of other painkillers. Combination. I mean, I might be wrong, but I always apply Occam's razors in this kind of things. So just the fact that these molecules occur in the same plant in nature does not mean that they need to act in synergism in a pathway in an animal like humans. So if you show me pharmacology, if you show me two pathways that upstreams or downstreams can lead to a synergism, then I think it's worth looking into. Just because they occur in the same plant is not a good reason, I think. So I'm not saying that combination of CBD or CBG might have traction, but if you ask me, I think a combination of THC and acetaminophen might be, more worth exploring, because at the least you know that you have two mechanisms that might actually be synergistic. So it's true. I mean, especially coming from Israel, Israel has always this approach of the sacred plant, that was developed for the good of all humanity. But again, it's a little bit the same discourse that we do for terpenes. There might be better terpene combinations. There might be. Are they relevant enough to, really discuss them? I haven't seen evidence suggesting so.
So insightful. We are already over the time, so let's make it quick, but I think this is relevant. Bertrand Thuremis, which is a medical affairs liaison out of Germany, is asking about the current debate in Germany regarding reimbursement of flower. And you also mentioned, Guillermo, the effect that Exilby might have, not only on that, but also on the reimbursement of extracts. So can you go into details on what evidence you know that cannabis flower should be reimbursed in a medical context? Very quickly before going.
Yeah, well, we show the flower power. I think that what we see is that the reason patients want flower is because that's what they're used to. Because when you self-medicate, flower is typically what you have available. So typically flowers are for patients that already consume cannabis. Extracts are for patients that do not consume cannabis and they don't have a preference on what is that they want. I think that is, it's good and relevant that adults have access to flowers, either from an adult scheme or a medical scheme. I think that the reimbursement of flowers, it's challenged by the use of flowers, because at the end of the day, we know that there is a lot of adults regulating the use of cannabis flowers through medical schemes. And and that's fine as long as you pay for your own flowers, but then the justification for the reimbursement with public funding becomes a little questionable. So I'm just saying that I understand it. Obviously I have met a lot of patients that are legitimate patients that take care of their health with flowers, and that the oral route might not offer the same advantage for them. So they should be they should have access either to flowers or to an alternative that is fast acting and that represents a true alternative, or a true chain equivalent for what they're doing.
Brilliant, Guillermo. Okay, so I can see that we could spend probably another hour talking about this topic. So much that we have. But I think it was an awesome conversation, and it's going to be available on LinkedIn, and also we're going to put it on YouTube. Thank you so much, Guillermo, and let's see you in the next edition.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.